Hi. So, I do not have a poem for you today, but before I tell you that story, I have to tell you this story. Um, I talked very briefly with Marcus, um, and basically all that we said was that we'll talk about it more this weekend. Um, I will say one thing, which is that if he is forced to stop making vlogs, I will definitely continue to do so. Um, well, I shouldn't say definitely, but probably. Um, but I definitely plan on it. I don't really know how, or what, but I will figure something out. I, like I said, we didn't really get a chance to really fully talk it over. We're going to this weekend, and we'll get back to you with more information on that on early next week. Um, so I'll just say this is sort of a shock to all of us, although I knew that some stuff was coming up for him, but I didn't really see this coming. But, it is what it is. Um, anyway, like I said, I do not have a poem for you. I actually have, a story. So here we go. This is called Guardian Angel. Jared was innocent. He had, in fact, never committed a crime. He was a law-abiding citizen who hated violence. The closest thing to a weapon he owned were two steak knives that came with his kitchenware, which he had never once used. And yet here he was, running down an alley, a gun in his hand, sirens blazing behind him, gaining fast. It was only a month ago that he had been sitting in his dorm, trying not to spill his tea, when his new roommate arrived. Jared had just put down his mug when he heard the door close. He jumped. He hadn't heard the door open with its normal squeal. It just closed. He spun around to see a guy standing there. He was tall, and the word spindly sprung into Jared's mind. He wore all black and stood very still. When he spoke, his voice was flat. "I'm your new roommate." Jared was speechless. When he finally found his voice, he said, "Hey, I'm Jared White." "I'm Casey, White." "You have the same last name?" Jared found him creepy. "That's weird." "Yeah." He was unenthusiastic. "Weird." Casey had two duffel bags. He unpacked the first one, and Jared saw that there was nothing in it but black clothes. Then he opened the second bag, and Jared was perplexed as he pulled out strange, seemingly miscellaneous items. 6 candles, each with its own matchbox, assorted chalk, a punching bag, 30 or 40 expensive-looking watches, a hammer, 2 jars of cherries, 6 oddly shaped clamps, and a multitude of assorted faceless dolls, each with different hairstyles and clothes. He attached the candles to the parts of his bed, as well as one to each side. When he began lighting them, Jared said nervously, "Isn't that like a fire hazard or something?" Casey paused, but then continued as if he hadn't heard. "Casey?" Jared stuttered. Casey stopped, whipped his head around, and said sharply, "What?" Jared just Jared was startled. "It's just, I don't know if you should light those candles." He trailed off. Casey stared, and Jared got the feeling that Casey wasn't even seeing him, that he was looking straight through him to the wall behind. Casey opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, and continued lighting candles. Jared dumped his now cold tea into the sink and went to bed. He dreamed that he was on a beach. The beach seemed familiar somehow, but he couldn't place it. As he sat on the beach, he heard a voice whispering, and it seemed to come from all around him, and the voice was chanting, and the volume rose until it was a shriek. Jared covered his ears, but the voice rose more and more. There was a clap of thunder and silence. Jared looked at the ocean and saw that it was not water, but ink, thick and black. And he put his hands on the ground and felt not sand but dust. And the dust rose, and he breathed it, and the dust in his mouth, and the dust was in his mouth and in his lungs. He sat up, coughing, and realized that his room smelt of smoke, and it was dark, too dark. The blind was closed. He stood up and walked toward the window, but tripped and fell. He staggered to the window and opened the blind. He turned and gasped. The entire room was rearranged. His chairs, one of which he had just tripped on, and the table had been moved to the edge of the room, and all his stuff, his backpack, his books, his TV, and his computer, had been thrown into a corner. All of this left a gap in the middle of the room, where there had been drawn what appeared to be a female devil with angel wings. He stared for a full 30 seconds before Casey entered the room. Casey shrieked, "Shut the blinds, you idiot!" He sprinted to the edge of the drawing and leapt across the room to the window and pulled the blinds closed, all before Jared could even register his demand. Then Casey dashed to the closet, grabbed a watch, set it on the floor, and smashed it with a hammer, which he had apparently been carrying around in his pocket. Jared gasped and flinched, throwing his arms in front of his head. Casey looked at him, and again he felt invisible. "Shouldn't you go to class?" Casey spoke slowly, enunciating each word. Jared looked at his watch and realized that he was, indeed, late for class. He walked around the edge of the room, keeping his eye on Casey, and left. Over the next few weeks, Casey continued to act strangely. Even every night before bed, he would light the candles, and every morning when Jared awoke, they were out. The chalk drawing stayed, and Jared was afraid of touching it or even looking at it. Casey got angry when Jared did normal things, and every time he did, he would yell and then smash a watch. And there were the poems. Casey wrote poems and read them aloud, and they echoed in Jared's mind. Poems of demons and killers and people alone in a dead, empty world. And Jared stopped noticing other people around campus. He didn't talk to anybody. He didn't look at anybody. He stopped going to class. And nobody else existed in the world. He just lay in his bed, sometimes asleep and sometimes awake, but always all he saw was Casey. And every time Casey looked at him, he felt more invisible, more hollow, less real. And then, one day, Jared awoke to see Casey standing there holding a gun. Jared stopped breathing. He sat up and instantly felt so dizzy that he collapsed on the floor. Casey said 2 words. "I'm ready." He crossed the room, and Jared looked up in time to see Casey raise his fists and bring them down on his head. Jared collapsed and didn't get up. When Jared awoke, he couldn't see or move, and his mouth had tape over it. He tried unsuccessfully to break free of the ropes that bound him. Casey removed his blindfold, and Jared could see by candlelight. Casey stood over him, holding his gun. Casey spoke. "I've called the police." His voice sounded strange, and his face was contorted with what almost looked like a smile. "They will be here in mere minutes. They will find your fingerprints on the gun. You'll go to the chair for sure." He used a knife to cut loose Jared's right arm, and Jared felt for the first time how strong Casey was. Despite Jared's best efforts, he brought Jared's hand to the gun and wrapped Jared's fingers around the handle. "I suggest you run." He used the knife to cut Jared free just as he turned the gun on his own head and pulled the trigger. Casey fell to the floor, blood pouring from his head onto the floor. The blood formed a stream, which flowed away onto the so familiar devil girl. It was when the dark red blood met the white horns that Jared snapped out of his shocked trance. He got up and ran. He exited the dorm and ran off campus as the police drove up. They spotted him and pursued. He turned down an alley and realized that the gun was still in his hand, but rather than discarding it, he held it close, though he was unsure why. A path opened to his right and he turned, aware now that he was running through the woods behind the school. Then the woods stopped. It was only 30 yards more before the path came to a stop just as sudden. He remembered that the school was built on a cliff overlooking the ocean. He stood with his back to the cliff and waited. He could hear cops running through the woods. He extended his arm, pointing the gun at the path's exit. His hand shook. The first policeman appeared and stopped suddenly when he saw the gun. "Put the weapon down," he yelled. Jared held his ground. The policeman repeated himself. Jared didn't know why he shouldn't just do it. In fact, it seemed to be what he should do. He had never fired a gun, so why should he now? He began lowering the gun. Suddenly another policeman appeared, holding a gun. The cop pulled the trigger. There was a loud bang. Jared couldn't hear. The cop had shot at him. They were going to kill him. He would die if he didn't do something. Jared raised the gun and fired. The gun bucked, harder than Jared could have possibly guessed. He was knocked backwards, and he staggered to keep his balance. But his feet hit nothing, and he was falling to the ocean below. He was going to die. As I realized this, I felt my everlasting restraints weaken, and I broke free and flew to him. I used my pure consciousness to push upwards, slowing his fall, and I guided his descent. I let him fall a few feet above the ground, and no sooner had he hit the ground than I was forced to retreat and return to my everlasting observation. I only wish I could do more. Yeah, that was Guardian Angel. I wasn't really looking at the camera, so I hope it was like on my face the whole time. That actually took longer than I thought it would, so happy Tuesday.